A great place to start is take a look at last year's. Chances are, the financials were sort of tucked in at the end with that little set of notes, and that's great. But let's look at every other page that report wasn't tucked into, and look at the stories and the pictures, and start there. What are those programs? What could you highlight financially and tie directly to the success in that program?
What are 3 steps that nonprofits can take to improve their annual reports? So, like, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that they should do to increase their impact? So I'm here today. We're on our video series talking about how to avoid the annual crisis. The annual crisis being the ongoing annual reports that every nonprofit has to produce every year. And I'm here with Maire from Blackbaud, and we're going to talk about annual reports, going digital, Blackbaud, and all kinds of other fun things related to fundraising and nonprofits.
Hi, I'm currently a software instructor with Blackbaud University, which means that I lead those trainings that maybe some of you have seen available for 90 minutes or 3 hours on Razor's Edge, Financial Edge, Blackbaud Award Management. We also do Microsoft and best practices. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to take my skill set in accounting and in database management and support all of our wonderful clients to have those aha moments that when I was a user, a client of Blackbaud, I kind of wish I had a few more of those. Once I got this job, I realized just how much more time I could have been saving if I used my tools correctly. And now I get to impart that wisdom on people who are in the position to actually start saving that time.
That's great. That's great. So what inspired you to focus on the training and the skill building aspect? Was it just your personal struggle with like trying to do things that maybe took longer or a little bit more complicated than they needed to be, or?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. I did take a lot of trainings when I was a client. I joke that I think I might have taken every single one that there was, but I was still learning how to apply things and kind of got a lot of tidbits that looking back, I'm like, oh, now that I understand that, I could have applied that piece of information. I actually stumbled upon this position because I was looking for an opportunity to just grow in my role working with nonprofits in grants accounting and database management. And silly me, instead of ending up on the job board, I ended up on Blackbaud's own job postings and saw that they were looking for a software instructor. And like I said, I was like, I think I could probably do that. I think I've taken pretty much all of those courses. And it's been fun. That was 9 years ago.
I love it. So yeah, something interesting you just said about like kind of the grant process. So something, when we were talking about, to other nonprofits about, their annual reports and their use, the one thing that always pops up is engaging the stakeholders, or prospective, donors or larger, corporations in particular, but also in terms of like the grant process, right? Like needing to capture like, the full checklist to be able to have that to show when they apply to grants that yes, that, they are a good match, right? So I think that's a very, interesting, piece. And when you're talking about like, storytelling and the financial side, like how do you kind of like take all these different pieces and like weave that journey and that story that could be used also for grants and then also for the annual reports?
Yeah, absolutely. Annual reports are a different beast than sometimes in the finance department we're dealing with, because it is so much more about telling a story with the figures that maybe you're used to presenting to the board on a regular basis, and certainly you're dealing with the auditor on an annual basis. But that you're solidly in, well, I need to put together an income statement. I need to put together a balance sheet. Here's what a statement of cash flows is. Now I just have to filter it or put the columns that are going to tell the story to my internal stakeholders about what's been going on accounting-wise. That's not the story that you want to tell to the audience of your annual report, to your potential supporters and your existing supporters. And like you said about grants, often at the end of a grant cycle, we have to put together some sort of grant report, if not sooner. And I have a pretty good feeling that the way that you need to categorize your grant reporting for the grantor probably doesn't tell a super engaging story on its own as just a list of numbers. So that's definitely one of those areas where we get to play around a little bit more with how do we want to present what these lines, what these expenses especially actually represent. You know, office supplies doesn't really generate a whole lot of intrigue. It's perfectly descriptive for financial reporting purposes. This is a good chance to rethink what are the columns, what are the sections that you are breaking things into, so that when you're explaining it in the notes, you can tell that story about, you know, this isn't just salaries, here are the positions that they're funding, for example.
Right, and then I'd imagine that in terms of the storytelling aspect, you want to, also, follow it up with the impact, right? So it's not just, we're spending a lot of money on office supplies and salaries, but this is, transition to like this is why, right? And kind of showing the impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. We don't want to think about how each individual dollar was spent on a particular program. We want to take a look at what's the cost of running this program, and then what's that return on impact that we're getting? What is the cost of the goods that we're doing? Not, well, I had to buy 6 staples last week in order to do this particular task of my job. That's not what I'm worried about. I don't care if you have a wonderful deal on office paper. What I want to see is, as a results-focused donor or potential donor, what kind of good are you doing with the dollar amount I'm considering giving you to leverage?
Perfect. And kind of, I guess, something that might be challenging for an organization. So say, they have like a shortfall, right, where their expenses are higher than the money they're bringing in. And I know that can always be a challenging situation, especially for a CEO to have to deliver that through their messaging and the report, and obviously to the board, right, to say that maybe we didn't have the best year. So when you're looking through like the financials and kind of the storytelling that goes with it, how can you kind of position that in a positive way rather than saying like, look, we had a really terrible year, right, which no one really wants to hear.
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially in an annual report, everything is enthusiastic about the past and optimistic about the future. And we want to spin whatever story we're telling in that way, because whatever happened over the past year, we're still looking at now the next year. Yeah, we're judging next year based on last year, especially again for those folks that we're cultivating. But we want to focus more on what did we learn? What do we know about what caused this, assuming it was unexpected? It could also be that there might have been an intentional dip into reserves because of a particular need, or who knows what could come up. And to inspire confidence in people who maybe initially see that number and say, oh, that's red or that's negative, being able to get in front of that by saying, you know what, here's what happened. And here's either what's going to change, or here's why I know we're going to succeed next year. So maybe it's not a great impact to celebrate, but it is a chance to say, we know what's happening next too.
No, I like that, and like focusing on the lessons learned, I think is really important as well, right? So having that path forward, right? Like, yeah, there's been some bumps in the road, and sometimes like especially now, the economy is maybe not as strong as it was a few years ago, and so people are holding on to their cash a little bit more, right? So donations might be a little bit lower, and obviously looking at the macro, helps paint a picture too, right? Of like we know, I think what would be interesting, I don't know if you've come across this, where an organization might be able to map like the economy at a macro level versus like their balance sheet, and being able to say like when the market is down and like the macro environment is not great, we notice that there's a dip, but we also know that when things start swinging up, that we see an increase, right? A certain percentage, to kind of paint that picture of maybe there's a lot of gloom right now in the economy, but we know that the light in the tunnel based on the last like 20 years of our organization operating.
Absolutely. And there's lots of work, even specifically doing that focus on reporting for nonprofits. So I don't even have to have an in-house economist to be able to say, well, I've studied market trends and this is how they impact us. For example, the Blackbaud Institute, and Blackbaud works with a lot of other key thinkers in the space to do that sort of analysis and to identify what are some of the changes that we're seeing, what is the impact of the last big financial crisis on giving today and where are things going. What does it look like the next generation is giving towards? What are the trends in donors? Like a lot of people are talking about how we're seeing more dollars, but actually coming from fewer donors. So there's lots of places that are producing resources like that. I would encourage folks to take a look at the Blackbaud Institute. I think there's some good ones there, but it's not the only one by any means. And then that's written for nonprofits, but we can then, exactly like you said, translate that to our stakeholders and say, hey, here's what the industry is saying. Here's what the actual reports are telling us is happening giving wise. And here's what we are expecting about that.
No, that's great. And I imagine like as a organization that having someone that's keeping an eye on those trends would be very important, especially as they're doing donor outreach and whatnot, right? To understand what are the trends that are appearing over the last like few years, and how they can leverage that knowledge to help with their outreach, right?
For sure. And it's also an opportunity to inspire support. If, again, you can tell that story of here's where we are, here's how I can tell you that I know how we got where we are, how I know where we're going next, and what we've learned, be that from experience or research, that can then engender that, first of all, sense of need, saying, hey, we know what we need moving forward. And perhaps, yeah, we are seeing some dips here and there, but you should have confidence in supporting us because we also know what to do with what we need. So it's a great opportunity to sort of flip that on its head. And instead of just kind of wallowing in where the trends are going, if the winds aren't blowing in your favor, but actually, again, telling that as sort of a hopeful story to invite a supporter to come in and provide resources in whatever way they can as a part of taking ownership of the future that you're stewarding.
No, that makes sense. And obviously, like one of the key things for like the prospective donors is having that transparency, right? But then also showing that path forward, I think is key. So when it comes to like so we're talking about like the doom and gloom side, right? So you kind of pull together like your survival guide for when there's a bad year, but when there's a good year, what do you like you like to like focus on in terms of like celebrating like like numbers? What kind of things do you like typically see that people like want to like push out, like kind of like make that pop in terms of like the financial storytelling part of it?
Absolutely. And we may not see quite as much variation year over year in general, because often that's one of the things that changes the least in an annual report year over year is, we've got the same structure, and all that's going to change is our notes. But absolutely, it's a great opportunity to tell that story in a new way and celebrate the opportunities that are coming up next. Again, kind of financially showing perhaps here's where we had growth and here's why that growth was possible. So doing comparative reports maybe in a different way that can celebrate successes and again tie them to the success stories that are in the report itself. So you read about Mika on page 2. This is that program that we were talking about. That's the face to put to the name of this report here.
No, that's great. And I'd imagine like having like a before and after, like even if just part of the storytelling, could show the impact as well, right? So like last year, like maybe this year, like they increased spending in a program at like 50%, and then being able to see like a visual way that the journey of this is where that increased spending made a difference, right? Like so, like I'd imagine, like when you see like kind of like the before and after, you can move your like your cursor like on a on the website, right, to see like the before and the after, like an image, right, like from 50 years ago to today. It's like I'm imagining like say like you're delivering like clean water to like a community, being able to show like an image that shows maybe there's some success, and then something that shows like like a lot of people with water and pulling it from the tap and stuff, right? So like using visuals with the numbers to make really like drive home that impact, right? And then when they go to donors, then they can say, look, last year we spent 50% more, and this was the impact, and here's like the visuals and the story around it. Now, if we can get your support to double it next year, this is what we project we could do, right? And I think that is like the kind of the magic of the annual report, right? It's not just saying what happened, but then you can use that to sell what your impact can do in the future.
100%. I love your idea of the slider, and digital annual reports are really catching on these days. So I would love to see someone give that a go and send us your report if you've got something like that.
We'd love to do that with someone that we've been producing a whole bunch of them over the last year, and we've learned a lot of lessons and doing a lot of cool things. But we've been doing like timelines and things. But I really like the idea of like even like a before, after, and like a projected, right? With your support, we can go from here to here to here, right? And like maybe it's like a stock image or something, or like that kind of like shows that progression. And then anything that can really help like paint that picture. So it's not just because the annual reports are typically like reporting on the past, right? But I think like giving that like spin of like this is what's next, and like tying that more in throughout the report rather than just having like a footnote, the CEO message at the top and maybe a little footnote at the bottom, right? Like every story could have like with your impact or over the next 5 years, according to our plan, this is where we're going, right? So it's not just what we did, but that there's actually good things that are going to continue happening. And I think like using the annual report, especially digitally, to sell the organization to different like donors, prospective donors, really is a really more effective way than a PDF.
Absolutely. Maybe we'll offer a PDF to the folks who aren't interested in all of the great ways that they can interact with it on a screen, but 100% getting a chance to really pull those pieces together in a more immersive way. I'm glad you're making that possible.
Perfect. One thing that I noticed in terms of like your bio on Blackbaud, kind of the emphasis of working smarter and not harder, kind of jumped out to me. So when we're looking at like nonprofit organizations, obviously working smarter is key, right? Especially when they're trying to maximize budgets and there's never enough staff. Every organization always could use like double the staff, and you kind of just got to roll with what the resources you got, right? So what are some of the key ways that like you're able to like help people leverage technology to work smarter?
Specifically when it comes to financial reporting, my number one is do everything possible to not have to mess with your reports in Excel every time you create them. If every time you're pulling together your board report or your annual report or your reconciliation with your fundraising team, which you have to be able to do to be able to have fundraising, right? Whatever it might be, the more time you spend every time you have to do that, well, that's just going to compound and compound and compound. But if you can save yourself 5, 10, 15 minutes on that weekly or monthly activity, well, now suddenly you have these open pieces of time that you've accumulated to start spending on maybe other ways that you can invest in saving yourself more time. And then what are all the great ways that can snowball from there? There's lots and lots and lots of customization available in different software solutions. Financial Edge being the one that I'm familiar with. But there's so many options that sometimes you have to deal with that trade-off in certain software between the ease of use and the control, right? You have more control, but that inherently means you have more options, more settings, and then that kind of takes away some of that ease of use because you can't have a simple interface if you're interfacing with a gajillion things. So taking the time to explore what your tools can do for you is going to hopefully find places where maybe in the front end, you have to invest a little bit of time because I have to go learn all of the bells and whistles in this reporting feature. I have to go set this up so it's got the right headers in this chart organizer. But then if you're able to scrape together those minutes to invest on the front end, you're going to have that option and that opportunity every time you need to get that information again. Push report or push button, get report. No more dreading having to dump the files, the figures into Excel. And even if it doesn't feel like a big deal, I have a pretty good feeling once you no longer have to do that tweaking every time you run a report, it's going to feel pretty good.
How is like AI kind of like coming into play here in terms of like these processes and things? Like, have you seen kind of like an uptick in terms of like the automations and AI that are being used?
That's a fabulous question, actually, very well timed with Blackbaud's semi-annual product update briefings, where we've gotten a little bit more of an idea of what Blackbaud Copilot's going to look like. I can only speak to that personally because that's again where my familiarity is. But one of the really exciting goals for when this tool is released. And one feature that I think a lot of people are looking forward to is the ability to describe something and then get it. I've encountered Microsoft Copilot in a few places, and it often offers that too, like in Power Automate. Describe it, we'll try to build it for you, so you don't have to understand how that works. And I see that as really allowing you to take that investment of time that I was describing of figuring out how to get the things broken out the way that you want it to before you actually run the report, so you don't have to do that manual work. Well, if you can just go to an AI and say, hey, I need a report that breaks things down this way over this time frame, and I need this comparison, and it could get you, even if it only gets you 80% of the way there, that's a great opportunity to then save that time on having something do something that maybe you didn't even realize the software could do. Oh, wow, I had no idea I could have a different page for every project, for example. Thanks for doing that work for me, AI.
No, that's great. And I mean, it's interesting to see how, quickly things are evolving. Do you have any instances where, like the people you're working with are using, like, say, Chat GPT to say, I want to accomplish a specific task, like, and so not replacing you per se, but, like, as a supplement, right? Like, oh, I have a question, and rather than, trying to figure it out myself, I can go to, Chat GPT or an equivalent, and ask for the solutions.
I haven't seen enough reliability out of ChatGPT for my product specifically to encourage anyone to go there. But we have recently added an AI component to our knowledge base as well, which I didn't even think of until you mentioned it. So thanks for bringing that up. And hopefully that is helping folks self-serve when they have a question, when they're not in class and they need to say, wait a minute, how do I being able to search a knowledge base as a typical natural language search engine has been around for a while, but it still can be kind of tricky if you're just phrasing something the way that makes sense to you and doesn't align with, the official software terminology being used by the support folks writing a knowledge base article. So being able to use that AI tool, I hope, is helping people to be able to self-serve those answers to get to where they need to go. A little bit more efficiently, spending a little bit less time, perusing knowledge base articles or trying to figure out what their question even is.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So when in terms of, like, the financial reporting, the financial storytelling aspect, are there any, like, common pitfalls that you see?
Um, it can be, and this is not a lesson of mine, this is some general wisdom, but it can be really tempting sometimes to measure everything and report on everything. And often that's necessary, that's the detail that you want. But when we're, again, switching gears towards an annual report and telling a story, it's okay to have bigger picture items. It's okay to have just enough slices to make a pie chart look good rather than to have a 10-way breakdown of all of the different streams of revenue. Or perhaps if you do want to have that 10-way breakdown, you'll do that in two forms so that you can have, two pie charts next to each other rather than one really dense bar graph. So that might be, other than simply copying and pasting your auditor's report of your financials, that would be the next pitfall, is if you're building your own thing, you don't have to get super complicated with it. You don't have to break things out in super detail, but it can be really tempting to try to measure it all.
Yeah, so basically keep it simple.
Yeah.
No, I like
I
that.
guess that's with my answer.
Okay. I think we covered actually almost all my questions. So someone say that is new to, like, the idea of, like, financial storytelling, right? Like someone that maybe just traditionally has had the annual report, it's telling what they did last year and then the financials. Like where do you recommend they begin? If they're looking at this and saying there's so much opportunity of things that we can do, like, how do I get started, right? It's kind of that, there's just, like, where do I begin, because I know I have to do this and this and this and this and this, right?
Well, like you said, there's been an annual report for a while in this scenario, I'm assuming. Great place to start is take a look at last year's. Chances are, the financials were sort of tucked in at the end with that little set of notes, and that's great. but let's look at every other page that report wasn't tucked into and look at the stories and the pictures and start there. What are those programs? What could you highlight financially and tie directly to the success in that program? Because that's what you're going to want to be doing the next time. You don't need to supply your own photos for your financial storytelling if there's that feature on page 2 doing it for you. So rather than having to say, oh gosh, what stories could I tell with these numbers? Take a look at the stories that have been told and think of which ones resonate closely to you with something that you could tie to those financials and use illustratively.
No, I like the I'm loving this idea of like using the financials throughout and not just like you said, it's always just tucked away at the end, right? It's always like, like here's all our stories and then here's the financials because we have to have them. I think, like being more proactive and thinking, how can the financials, not tell the story, but how can they support the story, right? And I think like highlighting the financials throughout, obviously where it makes sense, right? You're not going to say, oh, we lost like so much money on this program we failed to deliver. You're not going to include that in there, right? But if there's a real success of like every single dollar that came in, like there was such an impact, that I think it's worth showing, like with it, like like the financials, like some numbers or a chart to go with it. It really kind of gives a wow, like this is the impact that you did with only this little bit of this funds and only a few volunteers, right? And I think that can be really powerful in terms of being more persuasive.
Absolutely, absolutely. If nothing else, you can at least put a footnote on that program as it's listed and say, remember this program? It's the one from page 2. Go see page 2 for if you can't convince people to stick a pie chart next to a face or whatever, you can still call people's mind back to that. And it's good also to be consistent with naming conventions in that way. That again might be different from the typical naming conventions for reporting that you're using for your standard reports. Maybe you have a nice term that you use to represent a project, but is that the actual name of the project that's used officially? Maybe this is a good time to think about relabeling some areas of your report so when they see ABC program in both places, it's the same thing and they say, oh, that's what this is.
And I think like like when we're talking about like the power of digital is being able to have not necessarily a pie chart beside someone's face like you mentioned. Maybe I'm sure that the comms and the marketing team might not be thrilled about that, but if you have like a link that can pop up or expand within that area, right? So you have the financials on back at the end, but then you can kind of like pull forward or you can link to and you can jump around the report, right? Or you can expand collapse things so that people can dive into the impact a little bit more detail if they're interested.
Absolutely, absolutely. What better way to highlight that you're illustrating something than to have that picture pop up for you?
Perfect. So based on our conversation, is there anything that you think people should know that we haven't covered?
I think you've covered pretty much everything.
Amazing. So I do have a closing tradition that what we like to do. So on the topic of AI, I like to go to ChatGPT and ask a question. So I fed ChatGPT some information, and I got this question back, which I think we've already talked a little bit, but this is a little bit more detailed. So for those that are starting to rethink financial storytelling, what are 3 steps that nonprofits can take to improve their annual reports? So like what are the 1, 2, 3 things that they should do to increase their impact?
One I would say is visualize, not just with pictures, but with visual representations of things that maybe previously have just been numbers. Doesn't have to be a pie chart if you don't like pie charts. It can be a donut chart, it can be a bar chart, but having that simplified visual for folks will help turn numbers on a page into actual concepts in their head. Number 2, I would say is think about if you were to roll all of your reports up to the highest level, how would things break down to simplify what you might be analyzing? And that can also help you say, well, I can't put together this bar chart with 10 different lines on it. It's going to be super busy. Well, what if you were to roll that up into categorizing everything 3 different ways? How would that look and what story would that tell? And number 3, I would say is take a step back from your numbers and either try to tell that story to someone who's not familiar with your organization and see if they're getting that from the numbers themselves. We're so attached to how we track things because it's important, it's essential. But if you're sitting down with your cousin and saying, well, here's what this report is telling me, see what they're picking up on, and see what things maybe are assumptions that you have, because we do this every day.
Amazing. I know that was a tough question. So I mean, that's a really good answer. One thing that came to mind while you're answering the last one, when it comes to kind of like tracking numbers and data, obviously the financials get tracked, right? Is there anything that you've seen or you can think of that people might not necessarily think of tracking that could be valuable?
Oh, that's a good, because there's so many data points, and again, there's that hazard of maybe being tempted to want to track everything, and then cost benefit analysis is the burden of recording this piece of information worth it. One thing that I would encourage folks to do is to consider all of the different pieces of data that you can record, and if you're using all of them, because if instead of having, let's say, a separate account for salaries in each and every department, is there a way to maybe separate that out into another segment so that it's easier to filter by department? That also then makes that reporting a lot smoother, because so instead of saying, well, I want salaries, so I have to pick this salaries account and this account and this account and this account, being able to then just say, is it salaries? Is it department one? Is it this appeal? Can really help. So again, whatever tool you're using, think about all of the ways that are available for you to lean into the different pieces of information so that you're not doubling up data on any one particular place and making it harder for you to sort it back out. And really, I'll say my main lesson to that point really should be, anytime you're thinking about tracking information, focus on the extraction that you need. What kind of reporting do you want to be able to get? And let that inform the best way to record that data point.
No, that makes sense. I mean, there's so much data that you could track, and if you track everything, then it's one of those things where if you have everything, then nothing's important because there's just too much of it, right? So I think, like you said, it's like really to make that plan, and I think it's easy for the CEO to say, like, we need to track these 18 different metrics, but I think it's important to understand like the why, right? Because maybe there's only 4 things that really need to be tracked and that are more feasible, right? So it's as I know it can be hard to push back to a CEO when they say we need to do these 18 things, but I think just coming at it from that idea of understanding the why, and then figuring out like how can I help support that and present maybe a plan that meets the end goal. Because you don't always understand the end goal, right? So we need to do 18 things, and the reason why is maybe they were at a conference and like maybe someone was doing a presentation. They're like, here's 18 things you must start tracking, right? So it's kind of like figuring out like what is the actual reason, and then coming back with something that is reasonable, especially given that you might not have the resources to do these 18 things, right? You might because then you might need to go back and say, okay, yeah, we can do that, but we need like 3 more people to be able to implement this. Or why don't we focus on the core 4 that are more tangible and reasonable with the end goal. So I think just going back to always understanding the why is probably the most important thing.
100%. Start with the outcome. Another great thing to ask why is, why am I tracking this information in a spreadsheet out of my software system? Because I hope that you can find a solution that reviews all shadow databases, because again, that temptation to track data is strong. Do you really have to have those 6 separate spreadsheets that are all competing with each other because you can't find a place to put that information anywhere else?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, nowadays there's probably a tool for tracking everything. So I think it's finding a tool, but then also making sure you don't have 18 different tools to track 18 different things, right? To find
exactly
one or 2 that can manage the data and figure out like where the shortfalls are, rather than trying to solve create a different problem, right? Like, yeah, I'm not doing it in Excel anymore, but now I have 18 databases that I'm managing it in different software.
Very good point. Exactly.
Well, Mari, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and all your wisdom. And they've got some really good points, and I'm really excited about advising my clients, thinking about, beyond just the stories, but how the financials can help, tell the story, and how they can help support the story and present the picture of, the impact and the way that, the future, years that, additional funds can help support, greater impact, I think, which is what every CEO would want to hear, right? Is, tell me the story, but then also tell it in a way that can help us grow and, expand our reach and, achieve our mission.
Well, it's my pleasure. This was a real treat. I'm really excited for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.
Take care.
Bye.